Today, in First Aid Statistics, we are going to talk about something very important, sample bias, the difference between prevalence and positivity rates, and this in the context of STDs testing during the COVID pandemic. This series of video will give you understanding of key concepts in statistics without math to better understand the world and prevent manipulation in this era where statistics are everywhere and science as well.
And you have control over the
measure what the effect of this
different types of
Let's take a concrete example to illustrate those concepts. The other day, I was listening to the radio, a very serious news channel radio, and there was a panel of experts discussing how STDs and detection of STDs might be affected during the pandemic. So the speaker brought up a paper from the US where they analyzed a large panel of test results within the US showing that during the pandemic, there was a really strong increase of the positivity rates for several STDs in the US. And then, first they took a number and they really correctly reported this information, increase of positivity rate in the US. And that's usually where the main issue comes with statistics. It's usually not the numbers, because those are correctly reported in scientific articles most of the time. But it's about the interpretation. So you have this higher positivity rate, and usually this might imply that there is more cases in the population. So let's just define now two very important things: positivity rate and prevalence. So positivity rate is just the rate of positive tests among the people tested. And the prevalence is the number of people within the population with some disease in particular. So usually you don't have access to the whole population. So you take your sample, you compute the positivity rate, and you try to infer what's the prevalence in the population, right? And usually if the sample is really representative of the population, you will say in statistics that it's a random sample, everybody has the same probability of being tested, then you can properly infer the positivity rate in the population if you have a sample large enough. But the trick is, usually you don't have a random sample, and mainly during the COVID pandemic. Why? For which other reasons is it possible that the positivity rate during the pandemic increases without the prevalence changing, or maybe even changing in the opposite direction, diminishing? Well, because the sample is completely different. If you are in the pandemic situation, people who really have clear suspicions of being sick or in contact with some disease will get tested. And hence you have a sample of people with a higher probability of being sick that are being tested, and not just people without any symptoms, without anything going there as well for detection. So the positivity rate is necessarily higher because the sample of people completely changed. And actually, there was even a guideline during the first months of the pandemic in the US by the CDC to have only people with symptoms getting tested. So again, the sample is completely different and the positivity rate is increased, potentially not because the prevalence in the population is higher, but just because the sample is completely different. This is called a sample bias, and this is a concept very important to keep in mind when you hear and listen about such studies. And again, the key thing here is not the numbers. The numbers are correctly reported. It's usually about, the issue is about the interpretation. And here, the interpretation that the higher positivity rate means higher prevalence is wrong, or most certainly wrong. And the second thing that might be questionable about this conclusion is that this is a study in the US, and it might be very different in Switzerland or in other places in the world for many different reasons. The places might be not comparable perfectly. And this is a concept we call external validity that we will discuss later with other videos. I hope this has been useful for you. Please ask any questions, in the comments below. And also feel free to discuss other situations where you hear or suspect that there is a sample bias, and we'll discuss that with great pleasure.